Now, this is part two of the Napoleonic Age podcast. Now, Napoleon's empire will eventually collapse in a very short time. It's kind of like what happened to Hitler, Adolf Hitler, during World War II. He conquered all this territory in Europe and it collapsed overnight in a few years. And yeah, it was unstable and quickly collapsed, in a short time. And yeah, there's a lot of mistakes that Napoleon made. Some of these he could have maybe avoided, possibly. I've got three of them at least in the notes you can see that were examples of ones that definitely were behind it. One was the failure of the continental system, something he developed around, I guess, 1806, 1807 is about when it was developed. And the continental system was this attempt to blockade the British, put an embargo on them, and prevent any European power or any power really in the world trading with the British Empire. And it didn't really work, as you can see later, and it caused all kinds of problems for different countries, like including the United States. Like our country, the United States actually ended up in the War of 1812 with the British. It was because we were trying to trade with the French. They didn't like that, the British, and they started seizing our ships, our sailors, and all that. So we declared war on them. We thought we could invade Canada, all that. That didn't work either. Of course, the British invaded the United States and attacked us, and we didn't fare well part of the war, but at the end of the war, we kind of started getting the upper hand against them, like at Battle of New Orleans and all that, but the war was pretty much over. But anyway, but the continental system didn't really work for different reasons. One, I told you already, the British Navy was just too powerful, for the French Navy. In fact, the British started blockading the French coast and all that, which didn't help the French and all that. And then also, yeah, free trade, because, early capitalism was starting at that point. Different countries wanted to trade with each other. And so that was another reason why it failed also as well. Another mistake, of course, that led to the decline of the Napoleon's empire was war in Spain, the so-called Peninsular War, as they call it now, which broke out around 1807, 1808. And Napoleon found out that Spain and Portugal had opened their ports up to the British, were violating the continental system. The British needed, I guess, grain or whatever, wanted to trade grain and stuff like that with them. And so as Napoleon invaded Spain and Portugal, at one point he put his brother on the throne, Joseph Bonaparte, which really aggravated the Spanish, got them involved in the war. And so this guerrilla campaign broke out in Spain and Portugal to stop the French from taking over the Iberian Peninsula. But they also call it the Peninsular War, usually. You can see the word guerrilla originated in this war. It means little war in Spanish. British intervened. They started sending troops, supplies to help the Spanish and the Portuguese. And there was one named the Duke of Wellington, who we see later, named Sir Arthur Wellesley. He was involved. And the Spanish called the Spanish Leopard, if you read about the Duke of Wellington. But his troops called him the Iron Duke. I think some of you call him Iron Butt. He was kind of tough on people. You read about him. And their tactics kind of helped win later, and Napoleon loses a lot of troops fighting in Spain. Like, yeah, 300,000 troops is a lot that he loses. So that doesn't help him. Because he's having to fight different, fronts, the Napoleonic War. Of course, the worst mistake and the thing that leads to the downfall of the Napoleonic Empire was his invasion of Russia in 1812. It's kind of like what happened to Hitler, when he invaded the Soviet Union in 1941. It's been compared a lot, over the years. Anyway, it was different though. Hitler was trying to conquer the East, they think, and destroy communism and wipe out all the Jews. That's probably most what he was trying to do. Napoleon was trying to fight the Russians because the Russians had broke their alliance with them. Like in the Peace of Tilsit, the Russians were forced to ally with France. Alexander the First never really trusted Napoleon, and so he basically stopped the alliance and started, I think he started dealing with Britain, opened their ports up and trading with the British and all that. And so he violated the continental system. And so basically Napoleon decided, I'm going to take care of this. And I'm going to invade it with my Grand Army. And so June of 1812, Napoleon's army, probably 700,000, I think he had troops-wise, invaded Russia. And part of why they didn't fare so well was because about 2/3 of his force were mercenaries that fought with the French forces. I think the French forces itself, like French troops, made maybe 200,000. The rest were all mercenaries. They were a mix of people from Prussia, Poland, Austria, Italy, and so on. And the Russians used the scorched earth policy against Napoleon's forces. They refused to do pitched battles, which really frustrated Napoleon a lot. They realized that Napoleon's forces would live off the land. There's an old saying that Napoleon would say that an army lived off its stomach. They needed food basically to fight. And so they realize they don't have enough food, they don't have enough drink, whatever supplies. So it became a logistics issue. They say it's one of the main reasons why he lost was logistics issues and trying to supply his forces from Poland all the way deep into Russia, which I guess under Hitler the same thing happened in World War II as well. They did fight different battles. Like there's the Battle of Borodino. You can see September 7th, 1812 is the most famous battle of the invasion of Russia in 1812. It was actually an indecisive battle where neither side won, but it was considered the bloodiest battle of the whole wars. I think it was like 100-some thousand killed and wounded combined in the battle. 108, yeah, it's a lot. And forget how many generals were killed on both sides. And neither side really won. I think Napoleon just pushed the Russian forces off the battlefield. And then from there, he was able to take Moscow a week later. But it really didn't decisively defeat the Russian army. And so they were still in the field. And Napoleon was never really able to knock the Russians out of the war, like Hitler tried to do 1941 as well. So I think Leo Tolstoy, if you ever read War and Peace, which is like this thick, talks a lot about that battle in Napoleonic Wars. Moscow. Of course, September 14th, Napoleon's forces reached the city, not the capital, but the city of Russia there, and it gets there and the Russians are burning it down. They didn't want to leave him too much shelter or anything like that. And Napoleon stays for several weeks, thinking that the Tsar is just going to capitulate like he did with the Peace of Tilsit. That didn't happen. So Napoleon realized, I got to retreat at this point. And so starting, they think, in middle October, he retreats back to Poland. And that's when things get bad for Napoleon's forces. And he gets harassed by Russian Cossack soldiers on his flanks on the way back. His forces he starts losing a lot of people, either from the elements of the Russian winter, and then also a lot of people deserted, his forces. By the time he, I think, got back to what is Poland, he had lost just about most of his forces. Like, I think he had 10-15% left. And so the downfall of Napoleon, his empire and all that was very similar to like what happened to Hitler. Hitler lost it in the Soviet Union too, fighting against them, in World War II as well. So it has been compared, like I said before. Then what happened after Napoleon returns back to Europe by 1813, the European forces form a coalition against him, which was called the Sixth Coalition. So sometimes called the Grand Alliance because it had so many countries in it. Britain, Russia, Prussia, Austria, Sweden. They all fielded armies against Napoleon. Mostly Russia, Prussia, Austria, Sweden fought from the east. And then the British fought in Spain and pushed up through northern Spain into southern France. They'll come from that direction. And the Grand Alliance itself, the ones in the east I told you about, formed 4 separate armies. And the Russians, Prussians, Austrians, and Swedes eventually invaded Germany and fought Napoleon's army, which wasn't what it used to be at that point. Napoleon was only able to muster about 200,000 troops, and the other four states had 400,000 troops. They outnumbered 2-1. And the Grand Alliance eventually fought at Leipzig, Germany, which is in Saxony, northern Germany, the Battle of Nations. The Battle of the Nations, as they called it. And it was called that because so many countries were there trying to liberate, I guess, Europe from Napoleon. I think some people call it the Battle of Liberation. I think it's been another nickname they've called it. And in the battle, the Napoleon's forces got encircled by the four powers. And the battle lasted like several days, 4 or 5 day battle, I think it was. And he almost got annihilated, but he was able to escape because there was a gap in the forces. They weren't able to totally encircle him. And so he was able to back up, and he begins evacuating his forces back to France at that point. Napoleon, like within the next few months, loses all the territories that he had gained in his conquests. And eventually the coalition forces invade France. They're led by Emperor Alexander I of Russia. And in April of 1814, they take Paris, France at that point. And they force Napoleon to abdicate his throne. Napoleon tries to put his son Napoleon II on the throne as the next emperor. He only reigned like 9-10 days, and he was forced to step down by the coalition forces. Leipzig, by the way, that helped really defeat Napoleon in Europe. It was one of the largest battles in European history until they had World War I. So it was a pretty large battle, 600,000 troops, fighting the battle, and the one that really broke Napoleon, in the end. But he'll come back. There's one more time, we'll get to it later. He'll come back again in 1815. They all think he's gone at that point, Napoleon. Then you got the Congress of Vienna, which met 1814, 1815. This was a diplomatic conference of all the European powers that met in Vienna, Austria, in the capital of Austria, and Austrian Empire. And they were there, the great powers, to decide what they were going to do with post-Napoleon Europe, after Napoleon had been exiled at that point. And what happened out of that, they call it all kinds of names. They call it the Vienna Settlement, the Concert of Europe, the Congress Settlement. So it's got all kinds of nicknames, they call it. And they began to restore the boundaries of Europe the way they would be. They restored monarchs to power that had been taken off their throne, either by the French Revolution or obviously by Napoleon. It created the big thing it did that's famous about the whole Vienna settlement with the Congress of Vienna is that it created a balance of power in Europe that was supposed to prevent like a Napoleonic War again because it was so bloody. And it would actually keep a lot of peace in Europe until probably World War I overall. So it's got all kinds of names. Congress system, Vienna system, Concert of Europe, they dubbed it. Some people call it the Metternich system, which of course, Congress of Vienna was dominated by this Austrian diplomat who was their chief minister named Clemens von Metternich. He was a mastermind at just diplomacy and all that. And they actually have a period named after him, Europe afterwards, which we'll get more into, called the Age of Metternich, which is, I think, from 1815 to 1848. And he wanted to do a lot of reforms in Europe, but most of them were to really keep conservative monarchs in power and keep the status quo going on in Europe and all that. And that's the main thing he really did. He wanted to prevent radicalism, liberalism, nationalism from taking hold and keep like the status quo of various conservative monarchs in Europe. They did create more constitutional monarchs in Europe at that time, but they just didn't want a republic and governments like that taking hold because they thought it might upset the whole, monarchical system that was in Europe at the time. And again, the rulers like, Alexander of Russia were all for this and so on. And so they pretty much backed Metternich and all these policies in the Congress of Vienna. Now, after Napoleon's exile, of course, we'll talk about some things that the Congress did as examples. Of course, one of the most famous they did was they restored the Bourbon Dynasty in Louis XVIII. He had been taken out of power, and you know much about the Bourbons. They were three brothers: Louis XVI, Louis XVIII. They had Charles X. What happened to Louis XVII? They always ask me, about that. Louis XVII was the son of Louis XVI. He wasn't really never ruler. He never ruled at all, in fact. But he was imprisoned during the French Revolution. He died, I think, age 10 during the Revolution. And so he never really reigned, but the French Bourbons said basically that, they had Louis XVI died, and then officially Louis XVII was the ruler, even though he never reigned officially. And then Louis XVIII took over afterwards, 1814, 1815. And so he became basically the ruler after that. And the Bourbons, by the way, acted like the French Revolution and Napoleon never happened. It didn't happen. None of that happened. And so it's like it's kind of sitting around. There's no French Revolution, no Napoleon. But anyway, they put in Louis XVIII. I'll talk about it later, but he's put in as a constitutional monarchy under a constitution that's called the Charter of 1814, and that was a constitution that was forced upon him by the Congress of Vienna. They said you can't become, monarch unless you got some kind of constitution that's backing you. Otherwise, I guess they'd have another revolution. Anyway, he was put in power. However, he was only like 9 months in power at that point, and he's in there for several months. And Napoleon's been exiled. I forgot to talk about that, but after Napoleon was defeated in 1814, he was forced into exile. So where'd they send him? Well, the British sent him to this little island off the coast of Italy called Elba. It's a very, very tiny island. I forget how many square miles it is. I want to say it's 9 square miles. It's not that big. But it's kind of situated between where it's very close to the Italian coast, but it's just east of where Sardinia and Corsica is. And he stayed there for 9 months, and he actually helped reform the island, if you study about it. Kind of got bored, though, and they were supposed to pay him a pension. I think Louis XVIII decided, I'm not paying you no more, Napoleon. And so Napoleon got mad about that. He thought he could get back in power, and so some of the French whisked him away on some French ships, and they basically got him back to France, eventually in 1815, March of 1815 to be exact. So this started the so-called 100 Days, as they dubbed it, when Napoleon would return. He would rule a second time as Emperor of France at that point. And funny story about this, what happened was when Napoleon landed on the French coast and marched towards Paris, whatever, what happened was Louis XVIII sent forces to actually arrest him, maybe shoot him even, if he wouldn't surrender, basically. And I think it was under one of Napoleon's famous generals, Marshal Michel Ney, N-E-Y, Ney. And Napoleon came up to him, and they told him, you basically need to surrender and all that. And Napoleon came up to him, and he opened his jacket up and he said, if there's anybody among you that don't want me as your emperor, you can shoot me, basically is what he told them. And they were like, I don't think so, And so basically all the French decided, that they join up with it again. And so they declared, Vive la France, vive, long live, Napoleon, long live the emperor, and stuff like that. And so they all joined up with him, and he had to raise an army real fast. But truthfully, you want to know the truth, he didn't have a chance against the coalition powers. He was going to get his brains beaten out eventually. So Well, it led to 1815, the so-called Waterloo campaign, because coalitions form again at this point, the European powers. It's like the seventh coalition I think they formed against Napoleon. And so, pretty much Britain, Prussia, Austria, Russia, Sweden, all, declare war on him again. Actually, they declare war on Napoleon himself. He's kind of seen as a criminal now because he's fled exile from Elba. So Napoleon raised an army. I think it had 130,000 troops. That's how big his army was. And he had two choices. He could either wait in France to be attacked, like before, when the coalition forces made it in 1814, or he could go on the offensive. And the closest forces nearby were Prussian and British forces that were in Belgium. So he invaded there, near Brussels, Belgium. And I think combined forces-wise, the Prussian and British force had more troops than Napoleon had. But Napoleon realized that, hey, if I can defeat one at a time, I can knock out the Prussian forces and then knock out the British forces, I can even the odds. That would give me a chance. And then they'd have to recognize me as the Emperor of France and all that. And so that's what Napoleon did. So he marched into Belgium and eventually led to the Battle of Waterloo, which is, of course, the most famous battle in the Waterloo campaign in 1815. And Napoleon's forces mostly went up against the Duke of Wellington, also known as Sir Arthur Wellesley, who was really the best British commander in the whole Napoleonic Wars. Iron Duke, as they called him, was a defensive style general. He was a tough guy, too. I think they call him Iron Butt or some crazy name, because he was just so tough. Anyway, what happened was in a little village called Waterloo Village, which is south of Brussels, Belgium. The Duke of Wellington set up defensive positions on kind of a hill, whatever. So Napoleon's force had to actually attack it, which was really difficult. And that's one thing Napoleon always said, that you should never attack something like that, like a fortified position that's kind of high up. He broke his own rules, but he had no choice because he had already defeated, I think, the Prussian forces initially. He was having to defeat the British separate, and he was worried about the Prussians coming to help the British, so he had no choice. So Napoleon tried to use infantry charges. He tried even his cavalry, which got crushed. And then, of course, the most famous thing about Waterloo, which happened on June 18th, 1815, was that he brought up his imperial guard. The old guard was this crack troops. It's like the SS of the French, forces of the Grand Army, anyway, they tried to attack Wellington's center, like with a charge, and they got beat bad in a rout. And they were like every man for themselves, practically, at that point. And it became a rout, and then what happened was Prussian forces under Gebhard von Blücher came in and helped reinforce Wellington's forces. I think without Blücher's forces, Wellington may have lost, they say. That's what they always talk about, And so it became a total rout. And so the word Waterloo, if you know about it today, if you look it up in a dictionary, means like a decisive defeat. It was. A few days later, Napoleon surrendered at that point. And he was forced into exile again. And I think they say Napoleon was hoping to maybe go into exile in Britain. He talked about going to exile in the United States. I think he was talking about that. Let him go to the United States. I don't know if that's a good idea. Might try to overthrow us, take over the United States, They'd say, well, you're not coming back this time, buddy. So what happened was they took Napoleon, they exiled him to a little island off the coast of Africa in the South Atlantic called St. Helena. It's way down there. It's actually a little British island that the British would use for like a little port for their fleet, British fleet, stopping off from like South Africa, between South Africa and Britain. That's what they used it for. So he made him live on the island there for I think he lived there for 5.5 years, from 1815 to 1821. It was just an awful existence for Napoleon at the end of his life. So this guy that had ruled Europe now was just a nobody living on an island. And the British jailers that controlled it would respect him, about this. They wouldn't call him emperor. They kept calling him General Bonaparte, which really made him mad. And he was really bored, sat around playing cards, and I think it was a case where he took like a work of Voltaire's and did a reworking of it. He was really bored. Did some gardening. Yeah, that's fun. Gardening. Of course, the most famous thing Napoleon did, about it, on the Isle of St. Helena was he basically wrote his memoirs, which he dictated out to certain people. And that was really important. The memoirs of Napoleon really cemented Napoleon not just as a military genius, but as a great politician and reformer. And it rehabilitated his character. That's one thing about Napoleon. Napoleon became this great man, afterwards in history, especially by the 20th century. He's looked up to now as a man of the people and one of the first to really come from nothing and become a important ruler and all that. And which is different from Hitler. Read about Hitler. There's a book of Hitler back here you can see. I've got Hitler's just still villainized and associated with the Holocaust and all that, and totally different. So now they think Napoleon died of stomach cancer. His father had the same ailment. Apparently, died at the age of 51. He's very young man. I'm 49, anyway. There's been some stories that's been circulated like last so many years, especially in the late 20th century, that he may have been poisoned. There was this famous dentist, I want to say he was from Sweden, I believe it was, who did a study about it. And I don't know if you know the story about Napoleon, but one of the things he would do is he would give out locks of his hair to people as a souvenir. I think that's why later, if you look at paintings of later Napoleon, he doesn't have a lot of hair left. Mine's starting to go too, and all that. And apparently they think this dentist that went and started studying his hair, they found high concentrations of arsenic in his hair. There's been theories put forth that they poisoned him with arsenic. I think they seen that this dentist had a theory that how they did it was they put arsenic in his wine. He drank wine a lot, like a lot of people did, I guess, Napoleon. And they think that's how they killed him, in a short time. So later, Napoleon's buried in France. He'll be buried in his remains in 1840. They'll bring him back, and so he's still, idolized today. He's considered one of the greatest, military heroes, of France. Military genius. The guy was unbeatable, almost in battle. He was like the Nick Saban of generals. I think 43 battles. He won 38, lost 5. That's like almost 90%. It's pretty good. So anyway, but we'll talk about what happens post-Napoleon France. Of course, they put the Bourbons back in after Napoleon's exile the second time, and they put in Louis XVIII, and Louis XVIII really not that popular either. They keep putting these monarchs in and just can't seem to learn a lesson. They'll keep having revolutions. They have a revolution in 1830, a revolution in 1848 in France as a whole. And so, yeah, a lot of it's because of the rise of nationalism, which I'll get to later. French patriotism about their country and self-government. And we'll talk about later what happens in France. And my next lecture later, main podcast, second podcast coming up later, will be on the 19th century and the rise of nationalism. This ends this video.